you are using your books, you might want to mark number 280. That will be the invitation song.
Number 505. 505. Glorify thy name. We will sing all two verses. Number 38. 38. King Most High. We will sing the first, third, and fourth verse of this song.
Bye.
12. He is my King. Number 12. We will sing the first and last verse. All day long of Jesus I am singing. He my song of joy will ever be. All the while He keeps my heart bells ringing. For His love is everything to me. He is my King, and oh, I dearly love Him. He is my King, no other is above Him. All day long, in raptured praise I sing. He is my Savior, He's my King. In His light, I'm going home to glory. With a soul to trust His saving grace. Going home to sing and tell His story. In the blessed sunshine of His face. He is my King, and oh, I dearly love Him. He is my King, no other is above Him. All day long, in raptured praise I sing. He is my Savior, He's my King. The next song will be number 3. Number 3, lift your voice in praise. We will sing all 3 verses. And oh, Lord God of all the earth, we praise Thy holy name. The King of kings and Lord of lords shall
sing the first and third verses, and if it's comfortable for you, please stand. Number 104 in the supplement. Do me unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul, O my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed, let not my enemies triumph over me. Remember not the sins of my youth. Remember not the sins of my youth. Oh my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed, let not my enemies triumph over me.
I was listening real hard for that part where they say after this song we'll have the lesson, because Hank, you know I have gotten up here prematurely before. You've seen me in action on that. So, yeah, well, once this happens, it's memorable. Well, it sure is good to see everyone this evening, and I've been looking forward all day to our study tonight. We're continuing in our study of Bible characters. I love to study characters of the Bible. Some we have covered that are not as well known, some are more known, trying to have a balance. We've looked at Old Testament, we've looked at New Testament. Tonight, I'm going to ask you to turn to the Gospel of John, and we're going to be looking at John the Apostle for our character study this evening. John the Apostle. And if you'll read with me, beginning in John 1 and verse 35, the John that is mentioned here is John the Baptizer, because John the Apostle, before he's John the Apostle, is a disciple of John. So we're starting in the beginning and working our way through and seeing what we can learn about this Bible character tonight. Beginning in verse 35, John 1, again the next day John was standing and two of his disciples, and he looked upon Jesus as he walked and said, Behold, the Lamb of God. And the two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and beheld them following, and said to them, What do you seek? And they said to him, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? He said to them, Come and you will see. They came therefore and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. You see, John doesn't name the other one, he just names one of them. And I'll go ahead and tell you, John never names himself in the Gospel of John. So we see here that this is his introduction to Jesus. But in regard, though, to Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, verse 44 continues, he found first his brother Simon and said to him, We have found the Messiah, which translated means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, You are Simon, the son of John. You will be called Cephas, which is translated Peter. And the text continues. I'm not going to read, but it continues with other early disciples of Jesus. But this is where John himself, a disciple of John the Baptist, first meets Jesus. His life would never be the same. And even the detail of pointing out in verse 39, it was about the 10th hour. The footnote I have in the New American Standard says about 4 p.m. As he looks back, as he's writing the Gospel of John toward the end of the first century, he had no trouble remembering the exact time of day that he saw Jesus and spent that time with him. Now what happens next, you see, there's the introduction of these disciples. John is included. And what we have in the second chapter, it says, and on the third day. So there is a connection between the early disciples, including John, and the statement here, on the third day. So right away now, there's something else. And again, John and other disciples are going to be there. This is as a group, but they go to the wedding in Cana of Galilee, and this is where they see Jesus do the first of 7 miracles recorded in the Gospel of John. That is, turning water to wine at Cana of Galilee. The third day. So right away, he's meeting these disciples there. They heed John the Baptist's voice, the baptizer, when he's pointing them to Jesus, and now they're spending time with him. Jesus is conversing with them, gives Peter his name. Nathanael is mentioned, apparently Bartholomew. But already you see they're pulled in. They witness this miracle. And then they do some traveling. Because whereas we were here in Galilee in chapter 2, the first part of it, what happens when you get to verse 13 is the Passover of the Jews is at hand. So that's, of course, in Jerusalem. And so now we make a trip to the temple. Again, this is early on, but Jesus already has the disciples here with him, and they've not been named as apostles yet. But this is very early, and they're spending time with him. And what they witnessed when they got to Jerusalem was nothing short of amazing. I mean, tables were being flipped. Coins were rolling. Doves were flapping. Animals were getting out of the way. People were moving. He cleansed the temple. He told them to not make his Father's house a place of merchandise. And so they witnessed that. And the disciples would later remember something that was said there. They would remember the text that says, "Zeal for thy house hath consumed me," as they reflected on that. And when Jesus would be challenged, "Show us by what authority you do these things," Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." And later, after the resurrection, they would understand that he spoke of the temple of his body. But again, this is early. They're in on that. And the conversation with Nicodemus, the interview that takes place with this ruler of the Jews, chapter 3, but you continue. It is estimated that this ministry in Judea and this early point of Jesus' ministry occupies about 7 months in terms of the time element. And what happens is his ministry is growing. By the time you get to chapter 4 and verse 1, the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. And so his ministry is very successful. He is eclipsing John, though it will tell us in verse 2, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples. In other words, we need to see that John is among those that was kept busy baptizing people that Jesus taught. The other disciples were too, but John is included among those that are baptizing people. And so now what they do is they make a trip the way Jews usually would not go. They're going to Galilee, but the text says Jesus must needs go through Samaria. Because there's someone there that is searching for truth. She doesn't really know it fully yet, but Jesus knows her heart. And that woman at the well, the timing is such that Jesus, when she came, conversed with her and led her to a point of faith in him as the Messiah. Now, the disciples didn't witness that part, but when they got back, just as they were finished, as the conversation was finishing and she was leaving, they were coming, they met each other at that point, and they didn't question the Lord, "Why are you speaking to a woman?" But it's here, we got some food. And they asked the Lord to eat. And he said, "I have meat that you know not of." And they said, "Has someone given him something to eat?" And Jesus said, "My meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to accomplish his work." And so though he was tired and weary when he sat by the well, he was so energized by that conversation that for the time being at least his appetite was suspended. But you see, they saw the Lord. John the apostle, I keep calling him that, John, who had become the apostle, he saw the Lord being so animated and his love for souls. And he heard Jesus say, you say that, what does he say, in 3 months yet comes the harvest? And he says, but I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look, because the fields are already white unto harvest. Yeah, when I said 3 months, I didn't think that was right. After I said it, verse 35 says 4 months, and then comes the harvest. Lift up your eyes and look, the fields are already white unto harvest. So you see, John witnessed that. Now, I've said that because what we see here involves John in the early days, but is not found in the synoptics. The synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But let me show you how understanding everything we've said is going to help something else make sense. Now let's go to the Gospel of Mark. We turn now to the Gospel of Mark. By the way, John, our character study tonight, John is freely mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's just that in John, the fourth gospel record, he never names himself. He names all the others. All the other apostles are named, but he never names himself. He will talk about a disciple whom the Lord loves. And I don't know, we don't know his heart, but it may well be a mark of humility. That has been suggested, but he never mentions himself by name. But anyway, I've asked you to turn to Mark, the first chapter, because I wonder how many people read Mark and the parallels in Matthew and Luke, where it says here in Mark 1 and verse 16, Jesus is going by the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, that is, Andrew's the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. Jesus said to them, follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men. And immediately they immediately left the nets and followed him. And then in our next verse, we see John is mentioned. Going on a little farther, Jesus saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were also in the boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and left it to follow him. So you see, you have a initial phase of association with Jesus. The beginning, the first phase that's recorded only in John, but now here's another phase. Now he's calling on them to leave their occupation and spend more time and follow him. They're still not named apostles. In Mark 1, they're not named apostles yet till you get to the third chapter, and he will call the apostles. But this is, you might say, the second phase of training, the second phase of association. But anyway, I started to make this point a while ago. I've often wondered how many people will start reading in Matthew or Mark here or Luke. And here's the first mention we have of Peter and Andrew, James and John, first time they're mentioned. And Jesus sees them and says, come follow me, and they just leave their nets and followed him. I want to ask you, how much sense does that make to you? If what you're mistakenly thinking is, that's the first time they've seen Jesus. I mean, on what basis would they leave their nets and follow him? And if that's all it took, what if somebody else said, leave your nets and follow me? But when you understand, they've been with Jesus since John 1. They saw him turn the water to wine. They saw him cleanse the temple. They knew about that interview with Nicodemus. They were involved in that exploding ministry in Judea, where he's making and baptizing more disciples than John. All of that happens first. And see, I didn't go ahead to say this in John 4, but after the woman at the well, you get down to verse 43, and that's when they arrive in Galilee. But where Matthew, Mark, and Luke start is in Galilee. So they get all on the same page there at that point. So we see now a couple things about John. John was apparently from a family that was not the poorest kind of family. I'm not saying that they were abundantly rich, but did you notice what it says in verse 20, that James and John, it says, they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and left it to follow him. Servants is plural. they had hired servants. They were well off enough that they had hired servants. And another thing that I just, for our purpose tonight, cannot take the time to develop the thought, but when you read passages that include Salome as well as these other women and what is said, apparently she is a sister of Mary, and so there's physical kinship there on the fleshly side, but she's mentioned as one of the women that ministered to Jesus out of her substance. There were women that gave of their means to enable Jesus and the disciples to go about their work. And so that would again indicate a degree of prosperity. And yet another thing is that when Jesus was on trial, John was known to the high priest. And for that reason, John was allowed to be there at the trial and even brought Peter in to the courtyard area, where it turned out, unfortunately, he denied the Lord. But again, not just anybody had that kind of access to the priest and could have been in that position. So we know that much about John, that apparently in a relative sense, more well-to-do in the strata of society. But I said a while ago that now we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark for a couple of readings here. That's in Mark 1, where on the basis of this association that we already have learned from the Gospel of John, now they begin this association with Jesus where they leave their occupation and they're following him. And he has many disciples. Again, there's some ministry that they witness, but I turn to chapter 3, and it tells us in verse 13, in Mark 3 and verse 13, he went up to the mountain and summoned those whom he himself wanted, and they came to him. He has many disciples, but he's going to charge 12 to be apostles. By the way, it wouldn't be a bad idea if in your margin you made a notation of Luke 6 and verse 12, and just made the notation there that Jesus spent the night in prayer before naming the apostles. Again, that's Luke 6 and verse 12. He spent all night in prayer. But as I continue with the passage here, notice the wording in verse 14, and he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. What does the word apostle mean? The word apostle means one sent. Notice the two things. It says he appointed 12, number one, that they might be with him. That's the training part. They're not sent out to preach first. The text says that they might be with him. That's the training part. And I mean with him as in all the time now. With him. See, this is a different phase from that early association. This is even different than leave your nets and follow me. Now he selects 12, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. He'll do that later in the limited commission, and ultimately he'll send them out with a charge to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature as they're sent out with the charge of the Great Commission. Now, from this point on, as an apostle, there are many, John will share in the experience that the other apostles will have as a group. But, and of course we're not going to try to cover all that, but there are special occasions where it's recorded that it's just Peter, James, and John were involved in a particular event. For our purpose, though we could look at other verses as well, I'm just staying in Mark, because we come to Mark chapter 5. In Mark chapter 5, the Bible tells about Jairus, whose daughter was sick, and he asked Jesus to heal his sick daughter. And there's a great crowd. They're making their way to his house in Mark 5 and verse 35, when the words that no parent ever wants to hear were told that father. They came from the house of the synagogue official in Mark 5:35, saying, "Your daughter has died." Why trouble the teacher anymore? Jesus told the synagogue official, don't fear. Do not be afraid any longer, only believe. And here's where in verse 37, he allowed no one to follow with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So Peter, James, and John, they went into the house, and Jesus sent everybody out except the parents and those 3 apostles. And I love to read this passage. In verse 45, he took the girl, the child, by the hand, and he said to her, and Mark preserves the very Aramaic words that Jesus spoke, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And John saw that. And the little girl immediately got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. And they were completely astounded. And Jesus did something nobody else would think about in verse 43. He commanded that they give her something to eat. I will assure you, if your 12-year-old daughter had died and she was raised from the dead, the last thing you'd be thinking about then would be food. But Jesus knew that the girl needed something to eat. So there you have it. So that happens there. Then there's another case as we turn again to the Gospel of Mark. In Mark chapter 9 and verse 2. This is in the retirement ministry of Christ. And it mentions the great confession Peter made and the charge to the apostles, latter part of 8. But in chapter 9 and verse 2, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John and brought them up to a high mountain by themselves. And they witnessed that wonderful occasion. Peter would later write about this. He said, we didn't follow cunningly devised fables. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We were with him in the holy mountain. And Mark describes what happens here, that he was transfigured before them. I mean, usually Jesus looked just like anybody else, just kind of would fit in, ordinary. But on that day, the curtains pull back, and his glory is seen. His face is shining. His clothes are shining. They're manifesting his glory is manifested by all of that. And also appearing to him in glory and speaking to him are Moses and Elijah. John saw that. And Peter, James, and John, those 3 saw this. And they heard God speak from heaven. When Peter's making the suggestion, let's build 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, God spoke and he said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him. You know, there's a time to speak and there's a time to be silent. And we need to be silent and we need to hear what God has to say. That was the point right there. Hear Jesus. That's the one through whom God speaks. And by the way, in Luke 9, it tells us that they were speaking with him of his decease, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. He heard them talk. Moses and Elijah. He saw them and he heard them talk with Jesus about his impending death and what that would accomplish as he fulfilled the law and the prophets. Third time, where it's just Peter, James, and John in Mark chapter 14, and that is Judas had gone out to betray the Lord. So Jesus has the 11 with him. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus often went to pray. And he went to a certain point and told 8 to stay here. And then in verse 33, he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be very distressed and troubled, and said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch. He went a little further. One text will say about a stone's throw. But they were the closest to our Lord. In proximity to where he was separated by a short distance from these 3 men, and he treasured their association so much. And he asked them on that occasion to pray, to keep watch, to watch and pray. And then it describes, of course, his prayer. Well, Those are special occasions. But now I turn to the Gospel of John. And in the Gospel of John, I'm going to just mention, turning past it almost, that in John chapter 13, when it comes time for the Last Supper and the arrangement, Greg, it's not like the Da Vinci painting that we've seen in Milano. I could say Milan, but we Italians say Milano. You know, where there's you know how the table's set up in that beautiful piece of art, and everybody's sitting around the table, but it's not like that. They would recline at table, and in a kind of a semi-laying down position, propped up and encircling. But the point I mention that is just because John the apostle was the one seated in closest proximity to Jesus on that night in which Jesus would be betrayed. So I mentioned that in the passing, but I'm turning on further to the Gospel of John at the cross. In John chapter 19, John is at the cross. In John 19 and verse 26, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his own household. So here is John standing there. He's close to the cross. And though Jesus had brothers, John 7 says that the brothers did not believe in him. And so he left the charge of the care of his mother to that disciple whom he loved. And John accepted that. It said from that hour. Church history tells us, when I say church history, I'm talking about the post-apostolic church fathers, as they're called. They tell us that John took Mary with her, and when the church was dispersed from Jerusalem, that eventually he moved to Ephesus and took her with him. Again, that's a matter of history, but Westcott in his work says that no event is better attested in church history than that fact about John. So again, and the Bible tells us that he did accept that from that very hour. I would just say that when the tomb was found empty in John chapter 20, Jesus died, and then the first day of the week arrives, John is mentioned. In verse 2 of John chapter 20, when it was reported, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we know not where they've laid him. Peter was there, that disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, and so they both started running, except John outran Peter. And the text tells us of seeing the garments there, but of course the tomb was found empty. And then in the next chapter of John, when Jesus appeared to the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, called here the Sea of Tiberias, except they don't know it's him. He's about 100 yards away on the shore. They're in the boat. "You have any fish? You caught anything? Children, anything to eat?" They say, "No." "Cast your nets on the right-hand side." And they do that. They're not able to bring in the fish. And John said, "It's the Lord." And Peter got his garment and jumped overboard and swam to the Lord. But see, John was there when the disciples came and Jesus had fish cooking on the coals at the seashore. John took part in that breakfast. Well, now I've got to wrap this up. As the gospel began to be preached in Jerusalem, it's Peter and John that are specifically mentioned in Acts 3, and then in Acts 4, they're called before the Sanhedrin. Then the text says they recognized them, that they had been with Jesus. And they're included among those in chapter 5 that are beaten in verse 40 and rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. Then Peter and John are mentioned again in Acts 8. When the Samaritans had received the word of the Lord, they went there to lay hands on them that they might receive miraculous gifts of the Spirit. Galatians 2 and verse 9. This is where Peter and John, as well as James, the half-brother of the Lord, gave Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. By the way, in Acts 12, don't forget that John's brother, James, was beheaded. Think how that must have grieved our beloved disciple. All that remains is to say that besides the Gospel of John, John wrote 1 John dealing with Gnosticism, 2 John to the elect lady, 3 John to his beloved Gaius, and in Revelation 1, he identifies himself as the author, exiled on the Isle of Patmos for the testimony of the Lord. And thus the last book, the book of Revelation, written by the pen of our beloved brother and apostle John. And apparently the only one of the apostles to die of old age. So what we've done tonight is we've seen John from our first mention of him in John 1:35 to the last mention of him in Revelation 1. A devoted disciple to the Lord. I didn't tell you that he and James were called Boanerges, sons of thunder, but there in Mark 3, that's what they were nicknamed, because they had apparently such tempers. Because when the Samaritans would not receive Jesus, they wanted to call fire down from heaven and destroy them. But it is recorded of John that when he was unable to walk and was carried by others to services, that he would say, "Love one another." And he became known as the apostle of love. That's what the gospel can do. It makes a son of thunder an apostle of love. Well, you've listened well tonight. I think it's just fascinating to study these characters of the Bible and our beloved apostle John, and many lessons there to learn. If you've not yet obeyed the gospel, you now have that opportunity tonight, and if we can assist you in your response to the Lord, your obedience, we encourage you to come as we stand and sing. Be seated.